And the second talk will be given by Maria-Riita Taskinen from Finland, and it's on the liver fat nexus between diabetic dyslipidemia and cardiovascular disease. So please.
Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear chairs. First, of course, I would like to express my very warm thanks to Jean-Charles and Jamila for the organization of this meeting, and particularly making it so great success, because I think this has been really unique. And you know, we have had very lively discussion, and there's a lot of new topics which are coming up. So you really have been very successful, and it's great pleasure and privilege to be over here. And I also would like to say that my background for you and the cooperation has been pretty long, and I really greatly appreciate our friendship. So I will start.
It's okay.
Okay. Considering what I'm going to talk today, that is a team effort, as already highlighted yesterday by Chris Packard, and in fact, we have been working together for a long, long time, and the third member of our, I would say, wonder team is Professor Jan Boré, and this collaboration has been going over about 20 years, and I truly appreciate very much this collaboration, and I would also like to thank Chris, particularly because you yesterday really painted the background for my presentation today. I will start with this video to show you what fatty liver is. So I hope that this video really highlighted the epidemic of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that has swept across the world following the global epidemic of and pandemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes. And this will have severe consequences on cardiovascular health and will portend increases of cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, and now will have huge implication for health, being a real time bomb. We all know that diabetes is associated with a heavy burden of CVD, and that is highlighted over here, because the risk of developing CVD disease is nearly doubled in patients with type 2 diabetes. And also the life expectancy is more than 6 years less than a 40-year-old patient with diabetes compared to those without. So it really has important impact. And what is important is that in people with type 2 diabetes, the incidence of heart failure and fatty liver has increased about 5-fold in women and 2.4-fold in men. And as pointed out by the highlighted in the video, so non-alcoholic fatty liver disease may be found on average up to 70–80% in the patient with type 2 diabetes. And there is bidirectional association between fatty liver and type 2 diabetes, and I'm trying to dissect out this, but both of those are independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And in fact, that they can be considered to be partners in the crime together. So this slide just shows you what is the prevalence of now fibrosis and cirrhosis in type 2 diabetics. And as said, it can average up to 73% in obese. In non-obese subjects, it is less. And only about 20% will develop advanced fibrosis and even less cirrhosis. So you all do know that atherogenic dyslipidemia is important in type 2 diabetes, but I would like to highlight that there is similar atherogenic dyslipidemia also in people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that means that there is a combination of elevation of serum triglycerides and the low HDL cholesterol. Those are the components usually measured in the clinical practice, but this is not the only components, because there's excessive postprandial lipemia, and I'm going to discuss that, and that means accumulation of the remnant particles, preponderance of small dense LDL, and preponderance of small dense HDL. And so there is a cluster of lipid and lipoprotein abnormalities that are metabolically interrelated, so it's difficult to dissect out, are they markers or makers? And that is one of the key questions. So we have this combination of the atherogenic dyslipidemia with these components that we have over here, and of course it's lifestyle and genetic, which are influencing both increased triglycerides lipoprotein production as well as defective catabolism, as highlighted by Chris Packard. And this combination then leads to the increased cardiovascular risk. So we have run for years also these kinetic studies in a fasting state, and as Chris nicely pointed out and told yesterday, so there are concerning the secretion pathway, and that means the VLDL production in the liver, significant components which are influencing that, that is liver fat and also otherwise ectopic fat. On the other hand, on the clearance pathway, the important factors regulating for example, ApoC3. But overall, if we compare with the contribution by the increased production or the clearance pathway, so the production pathway covers roughly 20% only for the elevation of plasma triglycerides. So the major determinants really seems to be the clearance pathway, which explains about 50% of the variation in plasma TG. So overall, of course, the plasma triglycerides, there are two defects over there. That is increased secretion of VLDL particles and then decreased clearance of these particles, as Chris highlighted. We also looked at in these baseline kinetic studies which are the drivers for, the production rate, and as Chris indicated yesterday and did highlight our results, so liver fat and plasma glucose came out as two of the most important drivers for the increased VLDL-1 TG production. So already several years ago, we published this nice paper together with Jean-Charles and Jamila. And we did show over here the alteration of apoprotein C. And I really appreciate this collaboration because this cemented, not only collaboration, but this was the beginning also our good friendship. And so thank you very much. And in this paper, we did show the animation doesn't work. Okay, it came. This nice correlation between the ApoC3 and total triglyceride plasma levels. And in fact, the type 2 diabetic patient, there was more than 300, was the type 2 diabetes group included in field study. This represents a Helsinki cohort over there. And this allowed us to look at this nice correlation. And of course, this then have inspired us to focus more. Why do we have this relationship and what is the role of ApoC3? And this slide highlights to you the factors that regulate ApoC3 gene in the liver. And I would like to point out that there are several nutritional factors which influence these key transcription factors in the liver. And those are shown over there. And considering the nutritional factors, it's also saturated fat and unsaturated fat, which regulate ApoC expression as shown over there. But two important ones over here are glucose and insulin. And please first note that this has opposite effects. So what will influence ApoC3 at the end is the balance between these two opposite effects, and that is important to keep in mind. The glucose seems to be more important, and that is acting through the carbohydrate element binding protein. And both glucose and fructose can influence over here. And that explains why fructose is also, should I say, bad for the liver fat, because it will increase liver fat via this pathway. So the pathway is very important. So ApoC3, as was already highlighted by Chris, is really important determinant for the clearance of both chylomicrons and VLDL1 particles in type 2 diabetes. And this is also in postprandial state after a mixed meal. And we have also looked at the kinetics and metabolism of ApoC3. So we measured using the leucine labeling the secretion and production rate of ApoC3. And it turned out that in diabetes, ApoC3 secretion rate is increased on average by 40%. And that explains why there is an elevated level of type 2 diabetics, and it's very sensitive to the changes of glucose as compared to the non-diabetic subjects. And we have lately also looked at what happens if there is very low ApoC3 levels. And we managed to collect this ApoC3 loss of function mutation in our Finnish cohort, and this shows first the response to postprandial levels after a fat-rich meal, which has 800 calories, and that was mixed solid meal and about more than 50 grams of fat. And you can see that there is very flat curves for loss of function mutation carriers as compared to the non-carriers normal subjects. And this was also true for the ApoB48 responses that are shown over there. So there was quite dramatic changes, and then we also looked at the kinetics in these people, so in ApoC3 loss of function carriers and then the non-variant carriers. And the key point in this slide really is on the removal side. There's almost very little effect on the production or no. But if you look at the intestinal chylomicron removal, that was almost 3 times faster than in non-carriers. And the residence times for the hepatic VLDL particles in the liver was again 4.3 hours in the carriers as compared to 17.7 in the non-carriers, so threefold difference over here. And so there are really dramatic changes in triglyceride metabolism in ApoC3 loss of function variant. So this more or less confirms that ApoC3 inhibition will be a good target to lower plasma triglyceride levels. So next, I will move to the postprandial hypertriglyceridemia because it seems to be still, at least to some extent, neglected factors for developing the cardiovascular disease. And why is this important? It is up to our lifestyle, because in our current lifestyle, we have meal after meal, so we never come really to the fasting state over the 24 hours, except maybe early morning hours. And the highest values are seen, in fact, at the bedtime, as indicated over here, where we have measured the plasma triglycerides throughout the day in type 2 diabetic patients. And this means if we looked at the postprandial state, where we have the combination of particles coming from an intestine that have ApoB48, and then particles which are secreted by the liver as VLDL, ApoB100 particles. And in our blood, we had a mixture of these particles coming from the both sources. And the key point is that intestinal triglycerides are not secreted only in chylomicrons, but it's also they are secreted in particles like VLDL1 and VLDL2. So there's a mixture of both of the gut-derived and liver-derived particles in the circulation. And that is both in basal state as well as in postprandial state during lipid absorption. So next I will briefly discuss what happens if these type 2 diabetic patients are on statin therapy. And first of all, we had this group of type 2 diabetic patient which is extremely well controlled as shown over here. So it's really the glycemic control was very mildly elevated, but there was clear elevation, of course, by HbA1c. The second point is that LDL cholesterol levels are low, and there was no difference in these extremely well-controlled type 2s. And there was still seen trend for the elevation of plasma triglycerides. And there was no significant difference in the ApoC3. So what happened concerning the intestinal lipoprotein particles in these non-diabetic and type 2 diabetic patients, both groups on statin therapy? So if we look at the intestinal lipoprotein, so the first difference really is that in type 2 diabetics, there is increased production of these B48 particles from the gut. And there is also markedly increased direct clearance, which was almost minimal in those non-diabetic subjects. And of course, there was also enhanced changes in this clearance pathway down the VLDL1 and VLDL2. And overall, the most important thing over here is that the intestinal ApoB48 secretion, both particularly in the postprandial state, was markedly increased in the type 2 diabetic patients. So next I will move to discuss what effect will have GLP-1 glucagon-like polypeptide agonist liraglutide influences, the postprandial metabolism. This was study done also in type 2 diabetic patients, And again, these patients were reasonably well controlled as indicated by the HbA1c, and of course they were obese, no marked elevation of plasma triglycerides or ApoC3, and liver fat was increased. So what happened on liraglutide therapy? So there was, of course, improvement of all glycemic parameters as reflected also on the reduction of glycosylated hemoglobin A1c. There was small reduction also in LDL cholesterol, not significant reduction in plasma triglyceride, but significant reduction in ApoC3 concentration. And this slide shows now the response of triglycerides particles, chylomicrons, and chylomicron ApoB48 on liraglutide during a meal, as indicated over here. And there was highly significant reduction in both chylomicron triglyceride area under the curve as well, and even more prominent for the chylomicron ApoB48 response during a meal. So liraglutide treatment lowered significantly both triglycerides and ApoB48 in chylomicrons in subjects with type 2 diabetes. And in this study, we also measured the liver fat. In all our studies, we have been using magnetic resonance imaging, and we have had this collaboration with the same team of imaging people over the 10 years. And here you can see the response of liver fat to liraglutide therapy. The individual cases, and on average, the liver fat was reduced by 27% during this liraglutide treatment for 2 weeks, and there was small but significant reduction also subcutaneous fat, and that's well known that this agonist reduces also the weight. And here we have now the fluxes for ApoB48 and ApoB100 in triglyceride lipoproteins, pre-treatment first and then on liraglutide. And it's clear from this picture that the most pronounced change by liraglutide was really the reduction of the ApoB48 containing particles as shown over here. And of course, then there was less for the removal. On the other hand, if we looked at the fluxes down the chains, there was almost no changes over there, so the effect was only seen in the chylomicron particles, not anymore in VLDL1 or VLDL2. So liraglutide reduced markedly the flux of ApoB48 and decreased the direct clearance of ApoB48 particles during fat-rich meal. And this means that these changes may be reflected in less atherogenic remnant particles than without liraglutide. And this just highlights those highly significant differences on liraglutide as compared to pre-treatment values. And so how do we put together these changes by liraglutide GLP-1 agonist concerning the lipoprotein metabolism over here? First, there is this very clear effect on ApoB48 in the gut. In fact, the production rate was decreased on average by 33%. And there was also reflection in the VLDL1 secretion rate, because at the same time there is improvement of glycemic control, and that means glucose levels goes down, so it's less effect on ApoC3 secretion, and that will improve then also the clearance over there. And then importantly, there was also marked reduction of this direct clearance, whatever it means, of these particles, and those are the key findings in this liraglutide study. So we have several disturbances of triglycerides lipoprotein metabolism in type 2 diabetes, and those include that both B48 in chylomicrons and VLDL1, as well as increases of ApoB100 production rate, and that is seen in the baseline state and is well documented by several investigators. In our study, it was very minor because they were so well controlled. So glucose, of course, has an impact over there. And this LPL-mediated lipolysis of chylomicrons and triglycerides with VLDL are impaired, at least partly due to the increases of ApoC3 levels inhibiting the lipoprotein lipase activity. And the potential pathway of this direct delivery of triglycerides, chylomicron triglycerides in the liver may be increased and could be discussed, because that is still something that we do not understand too well. And these disturbances then results in this picture of excess formation of remnant particles with long residence time in the circulation, and that increase the cardiovascular risk. And the overall changes in fluxes of ApoB48 and ApoB100 particles in the chylomicron VLDL, IDL, LDL cascade of plasma triglyceride rises through the whole chain. And of course, we propose that this excess of these large VLDL particles is the root for the atherogenic changes in both LDL and HDL. So back to the fatty liver. So we should keep in mind, and that was not highlighted in this video, is that it is heterogenic, because we in fact have two important components. We have the metabolic fatty liver, and we have the genetic fatty liver, and those can also coexist. And there are just those genes which are named, which are the most common ones associated with genetic fatty liver. And so there's both environmental and genetic factors which influence here. And you know, I think that we have a good reason to ask that, is this liver fat really the worst kind of fat depot, ectopic fat depot, and why it is so bad is because it's not only lipids which fatty liver secretes, but there are several other important factors which are linked into the vascular health, which are produced by this fatty liver. And that explains why there is independent association, independent of the diabetic dyslipidemia. So nerve and cardiovascular disease share many cardiometabolic risk factors, and the challenge here is really to tease apart this complex relationship. So that explains also why the cardiometabolic complications associated with liver fat is so multiple, because it's not only atherosclerosis. There are also cardiac dysfunction, cardiac hypertrophy. It has been associated also with aortic valve sclerosis and with arrhythmias, particularly atrial fibrillation, but also with QT prolongation. And this then explains why all these complications are so multiple. And that is really highlighted in this very recent picture, where all those complications which are associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease are listed, and you can find all of those over here, not only one. So it's really a complex issue. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is really important, strong cardiovascular risk factor that increases the clinical burden of cardiovascular disease. And as said, it really associates with myriad of CVD risk factors, including both traditional and non-traditional risk factors. And it should be keep in mind that it associates with increased risk of non-fatal outcomes, stroke, coronary heart failure, and CVD mortality. And the magnitude of cardiovascular risk occurs across different stages of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, worsening of the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So today, we do miss a cardiovascular risk score specifically validated in non-alcoholic fatty liver patients. And I think this represents unmet need, and we should try to add non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the different scores. And this finding strongly underscores the urgent need to increase awareness and diagnosis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and proven tools for the treatment. And that will be discussed also by the next speaker. So I think that, as said, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is an important, strong cardiovascular risk factor that increases the overall clinical burden of vascular disease. But it should be also kept in mind that when we talk about this, so the cardiovascular risk is really associated with a metabolic non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but none to the poor genetic non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So I think we can conclude that type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and cardiovascular disease share an extensive platform of these numerous risk factors. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease independently increases the risk of atherosclerosis, cardiomyopathy, and arrhythmia, reflected then in the increases in CVD morbidity and mortality. And further research is definitely needed to define the mechanism linking type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and then atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And the preventive therapy for these are very important, but the lifestyle modification, of course, is the basis for everything. And finally, I would like to bring up this slide which shows this close interaction between type 2 diabetes and steatosis. Both are increased with increased cardiovascular risk, but the key point is that type 2 diabetes increases steatosis, and steatosis, on the other hand, increases type 2 diabetes, both roughly on twofold, and these are independent association. So this coexistence of these two really creates a vicious spiral where the presence of both of these are worsening the cardiovascular disease. So thank you very much for your attention.